My name is Christopher Sheppard. I'm originally from Provincial, New Zealand. I left when I was 17 and moved here, and I have worked at the St. Joseph Friendship Center since 2007, and I am currently the executive director. So the St. Joseph Friendship Center is a community-based urban nonprofit and charity. We provide programs and services to the urban, Aboriginal, and broader community. We've existed in St. John's. This is our 35th year of operation. We were opened in June of in 1983. And so in June we will celebrate 35 years of existing in this city. And we have programs that range from childcare to family resource programming, cultural programming, right now language and corrections programming, and a whole bunch of different other programs. We have existed at this location since 2002. We really wanted this building because we had tried for a very long time to open a medical hospital and a homeless shelter, and every other location that we had existed in, we couldn't get the right zoning or the right city bylaws to support that development. And so in 2002, when this location became available, the board was able to purchase it. And so shortly after that, the shelter and the hostel was built, and it now is the building that you see today. We go from literal babies until seniors and elders, and I think that's a really big focus of Friendship Centers, is that it isn't one. And I think what distinguishes Friendship Centers from other organizations is that other organizations typically focus on an age demographic. So it's young people or seniors or young women or young men or your average family. Whereas in Friendship Centers it really is about supporting the entire family unit, whether you're a baby or you're a grandparent and everything in between. And it's why Friendship Centers are so diverse in the programs that they offer. It's because every community is very different and that demographic is very different. And so for us, we don't serve one client group, we serve as many as we can. And it really helps support people throughout their life and throughout their individual situations. Not always easy or easy even to develop, but I think when you try to meet as many needs as you can, it makes the work a little bit easier, but not always the easiest to design when it comes to working with multiple age groups and multiple populations. I think it's about knowing the community that exists. I think when we look at St. John's, for example, we know that there is a very unique breakdown of the community. And so you have people who are Inuit, people who are First Nations, and even in the First Nations demographic, you have people who are Mi'kmaq, people who are Innu, you have people who grew up in St. John's, you have people who just moved here. And so I think knowing that community, it's a lot easier to decide how are you going to incorporate that knowledge into what you're doing. So with the Child Care Center, being wise about how that was developed and working with community people to figure out what that should look like. Designing it from the beginning was very smart, and they did a really good job of that. When we do cultural programming, recognizing that you should probably talk to different people from different backgrounds when you're looking at what you're going to do, knowing full well that you could have a Inuit corrections participant, you can have a First Nations corrections participant, and they're not going to require the same type of work or support or even intervention. And I think recognizing that it's possible to bring in cultural elements from different backgrounds into programs that you design isn't that challenging. It's just making sure that you keep on top of it, because it's hard enough to incorporate one cultural background into a program design. It's that much harder to do it for 3 or 4. And so I think being conscious of the differences and the challenges really helps come out in the end with a better product for a program or service. But I think you have to be dedicated to it. It's either you do it or you don't. Because one thing we've learned over the years is that if you only incorporate one culture or one background into a program, the other groups of people will feel left out, and so they should, and they will be very vocal about it. And so you either do it or you don't, because at the end of the day, you're going to be leaving a very specific group of people out. So I think you just have to be consistent, and you have to be dedicated to making that a part of your program design. And having people around that can support you in doing that is wise and important. And I think we've learned that it takes a lot of energy over the last 10 years, 11 years that I've been here to dedicate time to that, to make sure people feel welcome and comfortable and that they see themselves in what you're doing. I mean, we did our language camp and culture camp this past weekend, and it takes a monumental amount of effort to include multiple Indigenous languages, multiple Indigenous cultural practices into one weekend. But it can be done. It just takes 3 times as much money and 3 times as much time. And I think having a dedicated, idea that that's how it just should be done, at the end provides much better programming and a much stronger connection to the people who live in this community. I think we try. I think we're wiser these days. I think when you start off and you're really trying to have good partnerships and you're trying to build your relationships, it's really easy to get into this place where you just want to share. Here, you can help us too. This is how you should think. Instead of taking a step back and saying, is the organization even ready? Do they really have values that match with ours? And I think over the last year and a half, 2 years, since, we started talking around, the calls to action and reconciliation, as an Indigenous person, I barely know what reconciliation means myself. And so it's made me be a lot more cautious on who do you bring into your inner circle and who do you, teach and support. And, like last year, we took the time to recognize a couple of our partners who had either truly showed that they genuinely cared about us as an organization, that they were willing to take a risk or their own challenges by doing something for us, and that they were really, really willing to be true partners, even when it was hard, and even when it was challenging sometimes. And I think that's the greatest lesson that we've learned, is that it's wonderful and amazing to share our values and how we view education and programs and development, but it's smarter to do it with organizations that understand. Because you're not really helping your partner organizations if they haven't learned something or they don't recognize the differences that exist. And so I think for us, taking the time to step back and say, what does a partnership look like? What needs to be met for that to be beneficial to both parties? And to not feel bad about saying that I don't know if you're ready for some of this. I don't know if this is a good relationship. And so I think for us, what we've learned is not everyone is ready, and it's like reconciliation. It's a walk that you do with somebody, and sometimes they're just not ready to go down that road yet. And I think that's one of the hardest lessons, but one of the wisest lessons I've learned is just because there's an opportunity to partner doesn't mean that it should happen. Also doesn't mean that someone's ready to learn. And it also means that that's not a bad thing. You can still have some type of relationship, but maybe it's not the one that you want at the time. And so we've had to step back, especially this year, and say no sometimes. Or say, well, let's say what that relationship is. Or let's actually document what we require of each other. Or is this even beneficial to both of us? Maybe it isn't. And sometimes those are challenging conversations, but mostly they're honest. Which to me, I'd rather have an honest relationship and an honest conversation than to think that we're all on the same page when we're not. I think one of the biggest shifts that we've seen is the recognition in the work that we do in the community, and I think being seen as more than just a social services type agency or like a small family shop type nonprofit. I think, it's taken a long time to build the organization to what it is. When I started, there was probably 13 of us in total here, and we didn't have a whole lot going on. We'd spent a lot of time trying to create sustainability in a homeless shelter and hostel that wasn't sustainable. And so I think the changes really have been stepping back and making sometimes challenging decisions to ensure your survival. And it really isn't easy, and if I said the last 11 years was always fun, I would be hugely inappropriate. But the positive changes, I think, is a sense of security and a sense of innovation, and that we can be different, and we, can be a successful social enterprise, a successful charity, a successful nonprofit. And even if you take the Indigenous piece away from that, comparing ourselves to everybody has helped, because then I look at it as you're now comparing yourself to the best of the best in St. John's, for example. The best run organizations, the most successful financially, the best branded, and I think having that really high level view of where you want to go outside of your small box of Indigenous world really helped us strive for something that's better, something that's stronger, more resilient than almost any organization that we could see. And as we near 50 staff and, a very large budget, sometimes we look back and say, like, it wasn't fun sometimes, and it wasn't easy. But I think having that shift to say that you can be amazing and you can be better than other organizations and more transparent and more accountable and, better staffed. I think changing that mentality outside of just the Indigenous box has really helped us grow. But I think just looking at social economy, for example, as the rebranding of something old. Indigenous people didn't do things from the business perspective. We did things from the social perspective all the time and worked at making it sustainable and, bringing benefit financially or otherwise. And I think reframing social economy and social enterprise as an Indigenous idea that has existed for a very long time, and it's why we can be so good at it, because that social piece of what we do is inherent. Where in a lot of other non-Indigenous organizations, the social piece comes after. It's not the base of what you're doing. You're looking for the social benefit because of a business activity, whereas us, you're looking for the business sort of support from a social activity and trying to help the community from the ground up. And I think reframing that and understanding that core principle, that we are different in that sense, has really helped us grow social economy and what that means to us, but also to look outside and say what is the potential, what is the sustainability factor. And I think taking that stance around sustainability will take us into the next 20 years. The decisions that we're making now are around how could I get away from needing any money from anybody except for ourselves? How can I make sure that even after I'm not here, that we have a very well stocked, well supported social economy that sustains itself without government funding? And I think taking that principle approach and taking it from that place is different. Very few nonprofits have the sole purpose or take one of their biggest approaches in not needing government money ever. And I think when you start to focus in that space, that's what really can create amazing change. And so for me, I think the biggest change is how we view ourselves and how we make decisions and how we move forward. But also, how we work in the community. And that sustainability piece is bigger than just here and operating well. It's around making sure that in 20 years we're meeting the needs of the community in the best way possible. And the only real way to be doing that all the time is by not needing someone else's money. And so I think, all of that is strengthened by the work that we do in program development and design and supporting the community in a good way, but also looking at sustainability and social economy. It's really the only way I see in the next 20 years of you surviving and being successful is not depending on anyone else. I see us having a much bigger location. It's something we're working on right now. It's space. One thing we've also learned is that having your own large space can be monumental for sustainability. It provides you opportunities to expand or to rent space or support other organizations. 10 years, I would say we will be working on our 5th property probably. I would say we would at that point have built affordable housing in St. John's for Indigenous people. I think we would at that point have a very strong policy and research portion of our organization that can deal with government policy and legislation and respond to that quickly. And I think we'll be very good at helping and supporting the Indigenous community as a whole in how do you respond to provincial and federal decisions that affect people on the ground. And I think with urban migration and the continuing trend in urban migration, Provincial centers are pretty uniquely positioned to sort of respond to some of that. And I think for us, in 10 years, we'll probably be in that space or pretty active in that space. But also, I think in 10 years, we'll be pretty close to being sustainable in the sense that we don't require anyone's money. I would hope to be closer to 5 years to be sustainable, but I think 10 years is probably more realistic. But I think we'll also be engaging in that, policy and legislative change space more often than not, and doing it in a good way to provide good responses to decisions that are made in a timely fashion is how you change the future. It's how you change, government and their view of people. And so I think in 5 to 10 years, that's sort of the space that we'll be in. I think we'll be in multiple properties, and I think we'll probably would have expanded into housing and supporting people in that space. I think just recognizing the uniqueness of the community that we have. I think one of our best and greatest accomplishments is recognizing that the community isn't, bland and 1 or 2 Indigenous groups. I think recognizing that these communities are so diverse, to me, when you can see a program that's been developed for multiple Indigenous communities, to me that's excellence. Because it recognizes the community. Even if you're in a smaller Indigenous community, it's highly likely that you have Indigenous people from multiple communities there. And how do they see themselves and what's around them? How do they integrate with that community? How do they feel supported where they are? In an urban center, it's a bit more pronounced because you can't avoid it. But I think excellence is recognizing that differences are there even in our own community, and that you can't pretend like it isn't. And I wish more people could see it. I wish more people would respond to it in that way, instead of using this idea and this concept of like pan-Aboriginalism and that we're all just Indigenous people. Well, it's more complicated than that, and it shouldn't be, it shouldn't be looked at as, oh, that's too hard to handle or too much work, because we've seen it and we've done it and we've experienced it and developed programs for it. So I think excellence is recognizing the diversity that exists even in our own community, because we don't talk about the diversity in Indigenous communities enough. We talk about diversity as a concept, but not when we talk about our own communities. So I think to me, an idea of Indigenous or excellence in Indigenous education is that recognition that you can't just say Indigenous or Aboriginal, be politically correct, and that's okay or that's good enough. I think you need to be a bit more aware of the diversity that exists around you before you can start saying that you have excellence in Indigenous education.